Today, I'm going to try approaching things from a completely different point of view. I'm going to be talking about some anthropology and biology. I'm going to be taking a lot from this book, Human Origins, which is an anthology. And I'm taking from chapter 2 by a man named Roy Allen, who is, if I find his little bio, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and Human Ecology at University of Kent. And so, before I get started, it's really difficult today to try to articulate myself. In particular, trying to use this academic language is a real challenge. So, um, like I'm doing these exegeses because drawing from academic material can be extremely interesting and fruitful, but it also makes it extremely difficult for anyone to follow, I think. And I don't really have a way around that at this point. So I simply have to sort of articulate things the way that makes sense to me and not worry about whether that makes sense to anyone else, which is so counterintuitive to me. And so my way of doing that is essentially going to be reading each paragraph, and they're quite difficult. They're quite, yeah, intellectual is the word. And then talking about what I understood from each paragraph. And that's going to make it a little bit clunky. And hopefully I will be able to get into it and we'll have a chance to talk about language, naming, symbolic culture, episodic and mimetic memory, um, a lot of other interesting things that I will not try to foreshadow anymore. I'm skipping the introduction because I found it to be rather dull. The chapter is called Rethinking the Relationship Between Studies of Ethnobiological Knowledge and the Evolution of Human Cultural Cognition. And so this chapter is trying to answer the question, what is it that makes us human? Which is a good question, right? And the idea is to use a combination of biological, specifically Darwinian modeling from deep history to try and look at the period in time when we separated from non-human ancestors, but also to use modern ethnography, social anthropology, to try and find a kind of convergence point in our history between these two times, and focus on that. Okay, that was essentially what the introduction articulated, which is why I chose not to read the whole thing because it was rather dull. The first section is called, and again, it's going to be not very, it's like, what is Sam talking about and why is this interesting at all? And then hopefully it will become clear a bit more of why this is interesting to me. Again, we're trying to answer the question, what is it that makes us human? And this is in the context of hoping to be able to recover that, recover our sense for that. The first section is called Cognizing the Biological World. And the first paragraph goes, Alan Barnard invites paleoanthropologists to engage with social anthropology, meaning an intellectual tradition that had come to be recognized by 1965 as the British school, with its particular focus on kinship. But social anthropology, in its wider sense, refers to all that social anthropologists do, and increasingly this has been outside the narrowly defined canon of work. Given how social anthropology developed until the 1970s and the main concerns of behavioral ecology and evolutionary psychology, it is understandable that there's been a primary focus on hunter-gatherer studies and also on social cognition and kinship in seeking to apply its findings to human origins. But we cannot comprehend the evolution of sociality without attending to how early hominins and humans perceived their environment, organized the information necessary to evaluate it, and used it to adapt to changing circumstances. Now, there's a lot that was just said, but one way to summarize that would be that there's been a kind of over focus in anthropology on kinship studies, and that if we want to seek to understand human origins more directly, we need to focus a bit more on how we perceive and organize information derived from the environment, or from nature, one could say. This is the focus of the chapter. So, if I try to articulate that in another way, it's not just focusing on a time period that has to do with a combination of Darwinian models that are better suited to deep time and ethnographies that are better suited to modern day humans. So trying to look at a time period which can allow for convergence of those two types of modeling, but also looking to, um, again, this intersection between, let's say, nature and culture. And another way to talk about that intersection between nature and culture is to try to focus on how we understand our environment, how we perceive nature itself, and how we organize the information that we receive from it. The second paragraph goes, while it is recognized that hunting requires knowledge of animal behavior, there's been less focus on how that capacity developed. And while much of the mind has evolved to identify, harvest, process, and digest biota in the widest sense, comparatively little has been published on the use of plants by early hominins and humans as food, indicator species, tools, and medicines. Many of the cognitive characteristics underpinning the sharing and transmission of this knowledge humans share with other apes. For example, in regard to tool making or nut cracking. Okay, that's the end of the paragraph. And one way to summarize that would be to say that the key question in focus here is, how do we develop our natural knowledge? This is again, it says that we share a lot of that with other apes, which is a not unique thing, right? Phenomena. But there's something about the way that we do that that is unique. We're trying to explore what that is. So how do we develop our natural knowledge? The next paragraph goes, there are many similarities between human and non-human primates in terms of categorical perception. Comparative studies have demonstrated the importance of abilities to compose two or more objects into sets and make distinctions of the kind food or non-food, same species, different species, toxic or non-toxic, male or female, predator or prey. Though we have yet to find good evidence of more advanced hierarchic cognitions, such as taxonomizing or synchronous notions of causality. Abstract categories seem to require the kind of training that some chimpanzees have undergone, though some can achieve the same end using memorized images. Chimpanzees can also classify functionally, grouping, for example, pips and fruit rather than apples and pears, though it remains unclear whether these operations are routine behaviors in natural settings or simply potential evident in experimental situations. In the realm of social intelligence, too, non-human primate studies yield evidence that individuals can group others according to their pattern of association. Okay, again, there was a lot that was just presented in that paragraph. My way of simplifying that would be to say that there's a biologically built-in capacity to perceive in terms of categories, and that capacity is important to both humans and animals. So again, there are many similarities between human and non-human primates in terms of categorical perception. So this is a very adaptive capacity. It's this ability to take two or more things objects and to put them into sets, into categories. So that doesn't distinguish us. So the question then would be, okay, what aspect of categorization can distinguish humans? The next paragraph goes, there is evidence for genetically encoded prototypes in non-human vertebrates, triggering behavioral responses, such as aversion behavior with respect to predator-like images. That these latter are strongly selected for may explain why animacy as a phenomenon and certain life forms, e.g., birds, are more perceptually salient than plants, e.g., vines. However, Herrnstein has shown that pigeons exposed to pictures of all kinds of trees, as well as trees in different contexts, could differentiate these from non-trees. This has been interpreted as indicating the existence of a concept of treeness as a prototype. Okay, this paragraph is saying essentially that some categories are genetically pre-coded or very easily learned. Like some categories, such as the category of all things that are predators, is so obvious that it seems to be built into our biology. So categorization isn't just something cultural, it seems to be something naturally built in. Okay, the next paragraph is the final paragraph in this section. It's very short and it says, however we interpret the evidence, categorical thinking does not in itself separate humans from other animals. And we share many biological prompts which help make sense of the world, combined with more specific genetically encoded image response patterns. Therefore, the tendency to categorize the world and then act on the reconfiguration is an evolved and ancient function. While in all apes and hominins, the processes of categorization in both natural history and social intelligence are achieved through advanced neural plasticity of the prefrontal cortex. Okay, and so this is simply saying, I mean, one way to simplify all of that would be to say categorization is something that evolved a very, very, very long time ago. So this is a very ancient ability. Okay, so to summarize that whole section, what we've been looking at is we're trying to understand what is it that makes humans humans. And so we've been looking into a kind of period of time where we can see this continuity between humans and other hominin species, and namely in terms of this capacity to create categories, to take the complexity of the natural world and to compose it into different kinds of sets. And so we made this observation that that ability to categorize seems to be deeply built in. It's not just it's not a surface level phenomena, it's something that's quite deep. And so then the question, obviously, that would come from that is, okay, if that's something, if this capacity to categorize the natural world, to derive natural knowledge, is something that is in continuity with these other hominin species, well, what is it about the human way of doing that which is unique or distinct? And we're going to try to address that question. First of all, the next section is not about that question. The next section is, again, a very academic paper, and I mean, it's just an academic paper. It's not more academic than other academic papers, but this guy is at pains to develop evidence for what he's talking about. And so we've had this idea here of that one can have knowledge of the biological world, which is called here biological knowledge. And so what Roy Allen wants to talk about is the next section, physical evidence for biological knowledge during the Pleistocene. So this is like, okay, if we understand that humans and these other hominin species, we get this knowledge of the natural world. Well, how do we know that? How do we know that we do that? And um, Well, now we're going to explore a couple of different strands of evidence that shows that how we derive this natural knowledge. I think this is also going to show how important these abilities were to early humans. So again, what we're doing is trying to focus in on what is it about um, human categorization that allows us to organize our natural knowledge differently than other hominin species. And to approach that question, we have to answer the question, well, what is this biological knowledge that's being organized by humans or other hominin species? So we have to answer that first. That's what leads us to the second section, physical evidence for biological knowledge during the Pleistocene. The first paragraph, it's a long one. A problem in reconstructing the evolution of human biological knowledge capacity is lack of physical evidence. Macroscopic organization of the brain inferred from fossil crania and the postcranial skeleton tell us something about the ability of early hominins, for example, Australopithecus, and early humans, to perceive, interact with, and manipulate biota around them. Contextualized animal bones permit identification of butchering sites, hearths, waste areas, and processed objects. For the Upper Paleolithic, the significance of animals is apparent from artistic representations. Evidence for plant knowledge and use is, however, comparatively poor. For the period of 10,000 to 27,000 years ago, we have data on various plants as food, psychoactive substances, poisons, cordage, and textiles, and for plant processing tools, for example, mortars and pestles, needles, awls, and loom shuttles that suggest plant fabrics. Recent Spanish evidence suggests greater Neanderthal plant consumption than previously assumed, while Henry Brooks and Paperno have shown Neanderthals and early modern humans consuming equal quantities of plant matter, including seeds, and storage organs. From about 77,000 years ago, we have sedges and rushes from South Africa, particularly Cripocaria woodia for bedding and as insecticide, regularly being burned. From 300,000 years ago, we have wooden artifacts, and at 790,000 years ago, burned seeds, including olives, barley, and grapes from Israel. Okay, I said it was a long paragraph. So to summarize all that, it's saying that we have some, but limited, relevant physical evidence for this organization of different ways that humans have organized nature, essentially. All these different things that I was just talking about in this paragraph, they're different forms of evidence that humans were organizing and understanding nature in different ways. Again, it was saying a lot of it is relying on this physical evidence, but there's not we don't have much plants. We don't have many plants because they don't get easily turned into archaeology, right? The second paragraph, which is shorter, goes into that theme. It says, the shift between early hominins and early humans incorporated significant dietary change, but available physical evidence has possibly skewed our interpretations. Hunting and scavenging as practices and meat as food have received much more attention than use and knowledge of plants. While modern hunter-gatherers, and not only hunter-gatherers, prioritize animals and meat in ritual and cosmology, apart from polar and subpolar peoples. There is often a disconnect between the importance attached to hunting and the fact that bulk food is plant sourced. However, even where we can demonstrate from the archaeological record levels and kinds of plant use, it's difficult to know how these impinge on the capacity for environmental perception and classification. Okay, this is saying that, hey, plants were probably really important, and we haven't focused on that because we've been focusing on hunting and animals and meat. And it's saying, despite this notion that we can realize that, hey, plants were probably really important, um, how do we get from there to this understanding of how we organized and classified nature? Because that's the question that we're ultimately wanting to address. Okay. Again, we're looking at different kinds of physical evidence for human biological knowledge, meaning knowledge of nature and organization of nature during the Pleistocene period. We looked at these different kinds of archaeological evidence in the first paragraph. The second paragraph was looking at this idea that there was a significant dietary change and that plants were probably really important. Now, the third paragraph looks at fire use. Okay, what does it say? It's another long paragraph. It says, controlled fire use is a crucial step in an evolving capacity for biological knowledge, as it requires collecting phytomaterials and an understanding of their properties as fuel. In Eurasia, fire control becomes general by 300 to 400,000 years ago. In Africa, the picture remains unclear, though there is evidence from 1 million years ago at Wonderwork, which is a place. Fire is a precondition for cooking, and Richard Wrangham has suggested that the ability to cook both meat and vegetables had a major impact on subsequent human evolution, altering the apparatus of mastication, digestion, and nutrition. For Wrangham, the most likely threshold is the transition to Homo erectus at about 1.8 million years ago, where we find a shriveling of the gut, so much smaller gut, dental changes, and other features consistent with processing food. But there are doubts concerning the early dates for cooking and the social difficulties and costliness of its use. For example, the likely requirement for home-based organization and fire tending. Others have suggested that cooking is better associated with the appearance of Homo heidelbergensis between 500,000 and 300,000 years ago, which is much closer in time than Homo erectus at 1.8 million years ago. In this case, cooking cannot account for the anatomical changes mentioned by Richard Wrangham, though it doubtless made food more palatable, easier to digest, and calorifically efficient, releasing nutrients and removing toxins. Moreover, cooking requires knowledge of raw materials, their preparation, and the effects of their transformation, and may have made a big difference in terms of the role of seeds and plant storage organs in the diet. Okay, again, I said it was a long paragraph. We're talking about physical evidence for biological knowledge during the Pleistocene. The main impact of this paragraph is that fire, the controlled fire use may have evolved relatively recently, between 300 to 500,000 years ago, and may therefore not be able to explain the anatomical changes about 1.8 million years ago. We don't know when the origin of cooking was, but we can see that it had a big impact. Okay, two more short paragraphs in this section. It says, further clues as to how biological knowledge making evolved are found in comparative primatology. We have increasing evidence for the social transmission of plant and animal use among anthropoid apes and monkeys for food, including nut cracking, geophagy, and the seeking out of fermented biomass, for medicines, including dewormer and insecticides, and for tool selection and nesting tree preference. We know that chimps think about the spatial distribution of resources and about fruit ripening times, but have no way of inferring the likelihood of the existence of food patches based on the generalization of knowledge. They rely on memory alone. Chimps can, however, measure distance between paired locations and make harvesting decisions on this basis and cooperate in hunting. Okay, this is a different form of physical evidence for biological knowledge, and it's talking about how other kinds of animals, chimps, other anthropoid apes, and monkeys can do a lot of this biological knowledge making that we're wanting to talk about. So we don't have to rely on evidence from cooking, the controlled use of fire, and more modern evidence. We can look deeper into history. We can also see how deeply this capacity is in continuity from a long time ago, as in we can see that apes and monkeys, they socially transmit a lot of natural knowledge. So what is it about humans? Again, what is it about the human capacity to do that which becomes unique? One final short paragraph goes, we can make a fair claim that the basal hominin diet was plant-based and that omnivory was integral to an eclectic diet and a generalist feeding strategy in an environment where competing primate species were leaf-eating and more specialized. But although Darwinian theory goes some way in explaining how biological knowledge further evolved within human phylogeny, we need to turn to the anthropology of living human populations to find better clues as to how this happened. Okay, so essentially what we've been doing here is going through from a really, really long time ago and talking about how other kinds of species organize nature. And now we're approaching the relevance of ethnography, right? That final paragraph was essentially looking at, like we can see that omnivory was really helpful, having an omnivorous diet to these early humans. Okay. So we've been talking about biology and archaeology and the evolution of early hominin species. We're wanting to try and understand how is it that we organize nature? How do we arrive at our biological knowledge? And we've seen that other species close to Homo sapiens, like Homo erectus or like chimps, also do this quite a lot. So by looking at anthropological studies, by looking at modern ethnographies, we're hoping to approach an understanding of what is it about the human capacity to organize nature that is more unique. Okay, so the section designed to try to approach answering that is called The Ethnobiological Turn and Modeling Modularity. Okay, it's a little bit tricky. It's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs. The first one is again quite long, and it goes, anthropological studies of biological knowledge emerged from the Boasian ethno-linguistic tradition associated with Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf. Initially, this was concerned with demonstrating what people knew and how they organized that knowledge at the level of individual cultures. The prime exponent of this approach within ethnobiology was Harold Conklin. But by the early 1960s, Brent Berlin was showing how cross-language data could provide evidence of the way in which color terms were added to languages and suggesting principles that could be applied to other domains. This guided his work on ethnobiological classification and underpinned his universalist evolutionist approach. In the Berlin model, the ontogenetic order in which ranks are acquired in the growing child mirror the order of their evolution. For example, from generics up to higher order taxa, up to subgeneric taxa, up to the kingdom. And read that again. In the Berlin model from 1970 and 72, the ontogenetic order in which ranks are acquired in the growing child mirror the order of their evolution. Similar claims were later made by Brown, 1984 and 86, for the order in which life forms are added to language. Such mutually reinforcing ontogeny and phylogeny models have been common in anthropology since the 19th century. While not accepted by all, the approach has been influential among not only ethnobiologists, but also psychologists, cognitive scientists, linguists, and even social anthropologists. With its endorsement through the work of Atran in 1990, it has acquired the status of a new orthodoxy. Okay, I said it was complicated. Basically, this is talking about like essentially some of the origins of the discipline of anthropology and saying like they were concerned with the questions of like what do people know and how do they organize that knowledge? And they were looking at it culture to culture. And then these people came in that were essentially saying, hey, no, we can get these universal principles that can help us to explain how people do this sort of generally um, in a more universalist approach. And um, some of the arguments that they put forth as to why that kind of model is valid are based on this mutual reinforcing between uh, ontogeny and phylogeny, where there's a way that the way that an individual child learns to organize categories kind of mirrors the way that those categories have evolved over deep time. And this kind of argument has become quite influential and popular. And so to summarize that, it's essentially saying that the way that our language evolved through our categorization of the natural world was really important to our knowledge organization. So um, the way that we organized our knowledge of the world really depended on our categories. And the way that those categories changed, for example, in their taxonomic ranks, was really related to how language itself evolved. So it has a developmental aspect. And so it kind of matches phylogenetically and ontogenetically. The way that we organize nature in categories seems to seems to correspond both for individuals and for across evolutionary time. Okay, second paragraph is much shorter. It says, and this again, those researchers were Berlin and Atran, and it says the Berlin-Atran consensus has fed into the archaeology of human origins through the work of Stephen Mithin. In his Prehistory of the Mind, Mithin uses the popular model of multiple intelligences popularized by Fodor, namely Jerry Fodor, and others, distinguishing variously mathematical, social, linguistic, technical, and natural history intelligence in addition to general intelligence. In this chapter, I confine myself to natural history intelligence in relation to social cognition. Okay. Jerry Fodor is someone whose name has come up through John Vervaeke in the context of cognitive science, whose work was clearly quite important to multiple different fields. Anthropology, again, being quite relevant to cognitive science. Um, what this is helping us to hone in on is exactly the kind of intelligence that we think is maybe unique to humans here. That's, again, we're trying to understand what is it about the human capacity to organize and classify the natural world that seems to be unique. And again, we've honed in that relationship too. There's a combination of quote natural history intelligence in relation to social cognition. Okay, the third paragraph goes, and wait, I should clarify just briefly that this is model of intelligence that they were talking about, which is modular, namely that there are different modules of intelligence for different kinds of intelligence. I'm not going to comment here on about that. Like that's simply what they're talking about here, right? We're not evaluating it, we're observing at the moment. At least that's what I'm doing. Okay, the third paragraph goes, Mithin, 2006, accepts the existence of a strong module of natural history intelligence, which he argues comprises the principles for organizing knowledge of plants, animals, landscapes, and perhaps we should now add fungi. The key features of natural history intelligence are the universality of the species concept, sequential patterns of naming, mainly use of binomials implying kind of relationships, taxa based on morphological regularity, life form recognition, an underlying principle of hierarchy or ranking, and a propensity to categorize and name regardless of the usefulness of a species. Okay, so this paragraph was talking about the different elements of, quote, natural history intelligence. So all these different kinds of skills, um, recognizing, naming, categorizing, using taxonomy, ranking the usefulness of a species, or different kinds of taxonomy or ranking of natural phenomena. This is all involved in natural history intelligence, what they're calling natural history intelligence. Basically, what we're going to be looking at is how that has changed with social cognition, how that's modified with social cognition. But before that, two more paragraphs. This first one goes, in the Mython model, the trajectory of human evolution moves from general cognitive flexibility in pre-hominins to increasing specialization and modularization among early humans like Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and Neanderthals, through to cognitive fluidity through intermodular connection in modern humans. This model finds some role for a distinctive natural history intelligence in non-human apes. Modules for both social and natural history intelligence are predicted to have grown considerably by the time we reach early Homo sapiens, where a separate technical intelligence module first appears and is exceeded in size by social intelligence. In Homo erectus, social, technical, and natural history modules have all grown further but are of equal size, and social intelligence appears to have propagated a new, smaller, and overlapping language module. The same is true of Homo neanderthals, but with a larger language module. Among modern humans, early forms are presented as merging natural history with social intelligence, but without full cognitive fluidity, this finally being achieved in the Upper Paleolithic. Okay, in some way, that was the most difficult of all of them. It's essentially just talking about the development of these different kinds of intelligence through different hominin species, and saying that this is again this complexification, this combination of the specialization of different kinds of intelligence and their intermodular connections was really important to modern human intelligence. And different elements of that, both the specialization or modularization, evolved, but also the quite full cognitive fluidity. Again, the capacity of these different modules to talk to each other with full language. This was relatively late to be developed. So it seems here that, again, we're honing in on the fact that our social intelligence was really crucial to the way that we organized natural knowledge, and specifically social language. Okay, the final paragraph of this section goes, I've put it this way to emphasize the reification of the idea of module, the proliferation of types, the difficulties of measurement and of delineating boundaries in Mithen's approach, let alone establishing a neurobiological basis. There are good reasons to be skeptical of models of massive modularity, their arbitrary separation of capacities, the mythology of reverse engineering from the vantage of the Pleistocene that's prone to circularity, and insufficient attention to the potential of cultural cognition. Mithen's mapping of modules onto the fossil evidence is particularly unsatisfactory. I suggest here that a gradualist model in which social intelligence co-evolves with natural history intelligence is more consistent with current evidential and theoretical resources. It's a very complicated way of something that didn't need to take that long to say. It's essentially saying, hey, we don't have to buy into this idea of different kinds of intelligence with different modules. We can say that there's social intelligence that co-evolves with natural history intelligence. And we're looking at that co-evolution now. Um, yeah, so what is it about our collective intelligence? What is it about the way that our group cognizes as a whole, the whole tribe, our social intelligence? What is it about that social intelligence that was able to help us with our organization, classification of natural knowledge? How did there develop to be this feedback loop between our natural knowledge and our social intelligence? Well, that's a good question, and that's what we're going to be looking at in the next section, which is quite short, and it's called Nature Social Mutuality. It's actually two paragraphs. Anyway, I'm going to read the first bit of the first paragraph. It says, biological knowledge systems do not stand outside society, but are culturally and socially embedded. For example, because the environments of early Homo species were more risky than those of present-day hunter-gatherers, and food resources irregularly distributed, this likely exerted selective pressure in favor of new ways of using social links and increasing group numbers. On the basis of observed correlations between group size, neocortex size, and grooming time among primates, Robin Dunbar in 1993 hypothesized that as hominin group size increased, so manual grooming alone was insufficient to maintain social relationships. And so this initial pressure for larger groups, for larger groups, may have been predation risk in more open habitats and a broad spectrum food getting strategy. So what this was talking about is like um, there was pressure among early humans to organize into groups and increasingly into larger groups. And it was talking about why that might be, as in um, there were more predators and we could get more food if we go into larger groups of people. Well, what was the effect of this? Increased sociability and the need to handle social complexity, perhaps through pre-linguistic vocal auditory signaling rather than language capacity was a possible consequence, as were greater cognitive resources to underpin foraging strategies, including the sharing and transmission of biological knowledge. A corresponding increased capacity among potential sharers to construct categories, mind read, and empathize would have supported this. Dunbar puts the threshold for this transition at 500,000 years ago to bigger sizes of groups that, again, were increasingly socially complex and that involved a lot more sharing and transmission of biological knowledge. Where this ability among this increased capacity among potential sharers of food and knowledge to construct categories, to read minds, and to empathize would have really supported that. And again, the transition for that size of a group is at about 500,000 years, apparently, according to Robin Dunbar. Okay, it says, others have argued that the ability to solve ecological problems correlates better with brain size, and that big brains then permitted the solving of social problems. And one way of resolving this dispute of different kinds of models would be to assume progressive mutual reinforcement between social and ecological intelligence. Progressive mutual reinforcement between social and ecological intelligence. While great apes are equal to young children in technical matters, humans have been most selected for in terms of social skills. This would have permitted an increased role for culture in connecting domains, transmitting knowledge, and placing general intelligence into learning contexts. Okay, so that's the end of that paragraph, which is one of three in this section. And it's talking about well, what is it talking about? Yeah, it's saying that social and natural intelligence may have been in a positive feedback loop. So we're better able to solve real world problems in nature with these complex social units. And that kind of selects us for our social skills rather than for our technical skills. Yeah, it's essentially saying that our biological knowledge was deeply socially embedded. It's this nature social mutuality between our culture and our organization of nature. Okay, two more paragraphs and then I'm going to stop. It says, for non-human primates and early hominins, method implies that natural and social intelligence work independently. However, the partial integration of natural and social intelligence must have happened before the development of full language. Must have happened before the development of full language. Since Levi-Strauss, it's been recognized that at the core of human cognition is a necessary duality and tension, whereby humans understand the natural world through their experience of social relations with other humans, and the social world through their experience of nature. I'm going to read that paragraph again because it's the key paragraph here. For non-human primates and early hominins, Mithun implies that natural and social intelligence work independently. However, the partial integration of natural and social intelligence must have happened before the development of full language. Since Levi-Strauss, it has been recognized that at the core of human cognition is a necessary duality and tension, whereby humans understand the natural world through their experience of social relations with other humans, and the social world through their experience of nature. This is why, despite repeated attempts to counter naive dualism, and challenges to the culture-nature divide. The divide keeps on re-emerging. Related to this is a proclivity to attribute and represent the inanimate world in organic terms, and to attribute inanimate objects with the properties of living things. And they explain that it happens because we are bound to model our world directly on those experiences of our own body. And we employ this same model as a source of labels and concepts to interpret the world outside the body. We attribute human-like minds to animals, while the lexicon of animal parts is for the most part that of human anatomy. Botanical nomenclature is less anthropomorphic, and that of inanimate objects less still. But body terms, or at least terms that appear concurrently in anatomical lexica, are still crucial. How much of this is possible without symbolic culture is a matter for continuing debate. Okay, that final paragraph is again saying rather a lot. It's essentially saying that we model the world from out of our own bodies. So this is, in the sense of for e-cognition, our cognition is embodied, embedded culturally, extended throughout the world, and enacted by our doing. And we're looking here at the embodied portion of that, embodied and embedded in particular. So the way that we call nature, the way that we categorize, the way that we divide up the natural world, the way that we organize it, is derived from our own bodies, from our own embodied experience of the world. So what I'm going to do is release this as a series with the next chapter. And so I've done the first 3 sections in the paper. And I'm going to do the next ones next time. But before I finish, essentially what I'm looking at here is, again, this paragraph from Levi-Strauss, where basically we're wanting to, part of the reason for looking at human origins, right? What is it that makes us human? Is that we can observe all these different conflicts or tensions or and the problems that beset us can, I think, fruitfully be defined in terms of certain key polarities, like a kind of conflict, right? Is a tension between one thing and another. And so I've come to this idea through Jung and through my own experience, right? That by getting beneath the level of duality, we um, approach not unity, but a relationship between a third and a fourth. And in this chapter, social intelligence is representing that third, and natural intelligence is representing that fourth. So again, the third is kind of equivalent to the logos, the social cognition, our language, our culture, the human sphere, whereas the fourth is somewhat equivalent to nature, to the natural world, to that which is organized by our language. If I just briefly show that this is in terms of this, which is again a symbolic representation of an experience, and again, one becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth, I think we can clearly see how this intersection of social cognition and natural intelligence is another way of talking about the relationship between 3 and 4, which is exactly what I was hoping to draw out. If I reread the paragraph about Levi-Strauss in that context, however, the partial integration of social and natural intelligence must have happened before the development of full language. It's something that's beneath the level of our speaking. This intersection between 3 and 4, social and natural intelligence. Since Levi-Strauss has been recognized that at the core of human cognition is a necessary duality and tension, whereby humans understand the natural world through their experience of social relations with other humans, and we understand the social world through their experience of nature. Yeah. So this is another way, this is an anthropological, biological way of languaging the relationship between 3 and 4, which is essentially at the core of human cognition. Another way to talk about relevance realization would be one way to language that. Okay, I'm going to pause this here and continue with the chapter soon.